In the spring of 1969, a 78-year-old man lay in a hospital bed at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., and decided, for the first time in 25 years, to tell the complete truth about something. He was dying. He knew he was dying. The heart attacks had accumulated over the previous years to the point where the doctors were no longer speaking about recovery in the optimistic terms they had used before. And Dwight David Eisenhower, five-star general of the Army, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, 34th President of the United States, had spent enough of his life receiving bad news from serious men to understand the difference between a medical briefing that left room for hope and one that did not. He listened to it the way he had always listened to difficult information, which was without flinching, without bargaining, without the kind of emotional negotiation that most men perform when reality arrives in a form they were not hoping for. He nodded. He asked two clarifying questions. He thanked the doctor. And then he lay back in the hospital bed and began, in the methodical and private way that had characterized everything he did for 7 decades, to settle his accounts. Some accounts were straightforward. The letters to be written, the arrangements to be made, the administrative and personal business that a man of his standing needed to put in order before the end. These things had been anticipated and were mostly already addressed. But there was one account that had no administrative solution, and it had been open for 25 years, not because he had avoided it or been unable to look at it directly, but because closing it required saying something that he had never said publicly, and saying it required the kind of authority that dying gives a man in a way that living does not. The authority of someone who has arrived at the point where the normal professional costs of complete honesty no longer apply. Because there is no longer a career to protect, no coalition to preserve, no subordinate's confidence to maintain. There is only the truth, and the time remaining to tell it, and the particular weight that an unfinished account accumulates when it has been carried privately for 25 years. The truth was about a decision he had made in September of 1944, a decision that altered the course of the war in Western Europe, a decision that cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides, a decision that was criticized by every senior British commander in the theater and by at least 2 of his American ones, that was defended by Eisenhower in public for a quarter-century, with a set of strategic justifications that were accurate as far as they went. But that did not go all the way to the reason the decision had actually been made. The decision was his approval of Operation Market Garden. The reason he had never fully explained was a man named Bernard Law Montgomery. This is the story of both. To understand the decision, you have to understand the summer of 1944 in a way that the history books sometimes compress into a single clean narrative of inevitable Allied victory. A narrative that was, in the experience of the men who were living through it, anything but clean and anything but inevitable. The Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, were a success. Not an easy success. The casualty figures on Omaha Beach alone were sufficient to ensure that the word success required permanent qualification. But a success in the essential sense that the Allies got ashore, stayed ashore, and the German counterattacks that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had planned to drive them back into the sea did not materialize with the force or the timing that Rommel needed. The Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead in late July and August was one of the fastest sustained armored advances in the history of mechanized warfare. Paris fell on August 25. By the first week of September, Allied forces had advanced from the Normandy beaches to the German border in roughly 6 weeks. Logistical calculations that had projected 11 months of gradual advance had been compressed into less than 3. And then in the first week of September, the advance stopped. Not because of German resistance, though the Germans were strengthening their line with the specific energy of a force that has reached its own border and understands there is nothing behind it worth retreating to. The advance stopped because the Allied supply system had been designed for an 11-month advance and had been asked to sustain a 6-week one, and the mathematics of that compression were unforgiving. The trucks that carried fuel and ammunition from the Norman beaches were now traveling routes 3 and 4 times as long as the routes they had been built to cover. And at a certain point, the fuel required to move the fuel consumes the fuel, and the front line goes silent not from German shells but from empty NKS and empty ammunition crates. By early September, Patton's Third Army, the spearhead of the Allied advance, the force that had covered more ground faster than any comparable unit in the theater, was stopped in place. Patton reported to Eisenhower that his tanks were immobilized not by German resistance, but by the absence of gasoline to move them. The war that had seemed in August to be rushing toward its end had stalled at the frontier of the country it had come to defeat. It was in this context, a stopped advance, a supply system at its limit, a German defense reconsolidating by the day, and an Allied high command beginning to understand that the war would not end in 1940 for the way everyone had assumed, that Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery came to Eisenhower with a plan. Eisenhower had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December of 1943. He was 53 years old, and his selection for the role was based not primarily on tactical brilliance. He did not claim that quality, and the record does not particularly support it, but on something rarer, and in a coalition command more strategically essential. He could manage people. Specifically, he could manage the category of people that the Supreme Commander's role required him to manage. Brilliant, proud, nationally identified, personally ambitious, temperamentally difficult senior commanders who had spent years fighting their own wars under their own flags, and who now had to be induced, somehow, to accept a unified command structure that none of them fully trusted, and that their respective military and national cultures had not traditionally been inclined to welcome. He managed them through patience that was almost inexhaustible in its professional performance, through the willingness to absorb professional challenges that most officers of his rank would have found intolerable, through a genuine orientation toward the mission rather than toward his own standing, and through a public serenity that concealed from nearly everyone around him the degree to which the coalition's management was costing him personally. His letters to his wife during the campaign, portions of which were released decades after his death, contain passages that describe levels of stress and frustration that the public record of the same period does not hint at. He maintained the serenity because the serenity was the job, because a supreme commander who is seen to be struggling with his commanders has already begun to fail at the central function of the role, which is to keep those commanders working together rather than against each other and against him. But some men are harder to manage than others, and of all the formidable and difficult personalities in the European theater, and the list included Patton, who was a category unto himself, and Mark Clark, and Charles de Gaulle, who was not technically under Eisenhower's command but whose management required at least as much energy as anyone who was, none was harder, over the sustained run of the campaign, than Montgomery. Bernard Law Montgomery was 56 years old in the autumn of 1944. He was a small, precise, sharp-eyed man who had remade the British Eighth Army from a defeated force into the army that destroyed Rommel at El Alamein in 1942, and who had emerged from that victory with a public standing in Britain that was close to legendary, and a professional self-assessment that matched that standing exactly. He was not an easy man in any context, but he was a particularly difficult man in the specific context of coalition command, because he combined extraordinary professional competence with an absolute conviction that his judgment was superior to anyone else's in the theater, including Eisenhower's, and that the proper function of the Supreme Commander was to recognize this and to organize Allied strategy accordingly. This conviction expressed itself in ways that ranged from professionally problematic to personally remarkable. In meetings with American officers, he could be condescending with a fluency that suggested long practice. In his correspondence with Eisenhower, his memoranda had the quality of instructions from a senior to a junior rather than submissions from one commander to another. He pressed persistently and relentlessly for a restructuring of Allied ground command that would place all forces under a single land commander, and the single land commander he had in mind was himself. When Eisenhower did not immediately comply, Montgomery pressed again. When Eisenhower explained his reasoning, Montgomery resubmitted the argument in revised form. When Eisenhower declined the revised argument, Montgomery escalated, through informal channels and formal ones, through the kinds of communications that leave no official record, but that leave very definite impressions on the men who receive them, up to and including suggestions that the failure to accept his strategy vision would have consequences for the coherence of the alliance that would reflect badly on those responsible. Eisenhower's biographers have handled this dynamic in various ways, ranging from treating it as a manageable professional disagreement to treating it as a sustained campaign of institutional pressure that would have been career-ending for any officer of lesser standing who directed it at a superior. What is clear from the record is that Eisenhower absorbed it, managed it, and paid a considerable personal cost in the managing. What is also clear is that, by the fall of 1944, the cost had reached a level that was influencing decisions in ways that the official record did not fully capture at the time. The strategic argument between them was real and substantive and continues to generate genuine historical debate. Eisenhower believed in the broad front, advancing on multiple axes simultaneously, keeping the German defense distributed and unable to concentrate against any single point of Allied pressure, maintaining flexibility and sustaining pressure across the whole theater. Montgomery believed in the narrow thrust, concentrating all available Allied resources behind a single powerful force and driving it into Germany before the Germans could reconsolidate their defenses. Each approach had genuine merits. Each had genuine vulnerabilities. Serious military historians have argued both sides with evidence and intelligence, and no definitive verdict has emerged that satisfies everyone who has looked carefully at the question. But in September of 1944, the argument was not being conducted entirely on its strategic merits. By that point, it had been running, at varying levels of intensity, for months. It had accumulated the particular burden that any sustained argument accumulates when one party is pressing it with the force of an absolute conviction, and the other party is absorbing it with the discipline of a man who cannot afford to let the argument produce an open break. Eisenhower had been managing this dynamic since Normandy, where Montgomery's failure to capture Caen on the schedule, the plan required, had generated frustration across the Allied command, and where Montgomery had managed, with impressive skill, to redirect the narrative of that failure into a story in which everything had gone according to a plan that no one else had apparently been briefed on. Eisenhower had accepted this narrative in public, because the alternative, exposing it, would have damaged the relationship at a moment when the relationship had to be maintained. On September 10, 1944, Eisenhower flew to Belgium to meet with Montgomery at an airfield near Brussels. He flew to Montgomery rather than requiring Montgomery to come to him, a gesture that was not logistically necessary and was therefore a communication, a demonstration of how much Eisenhower was willing to do to keep the relationship functional. He had injured his knee badly in an aircraft incident the previous week and was in significant pain for the journey. This detail is recorded in the accounts of the meeting and matters not as medical history, but as context. The man who arrived to manage the most difficult conversation of the European campaign was doing so in physical discomfort that he had chosen not to let prevent the meeting, because the meeting was necessary, and the discomfort was not a reason to skip things that were necessary. Montgomery came to the meeting with his strategic case at full force and with something additional, an operational plan. He had been developing it with his staff for several weeks, and it was, by any measure, audacious. It was called Operation Market Garden, and it proposed the simultaneous use of 3 Allied airborne divisions, the American 82 and 101, and the British 1, to seize a corridor of bridges over the major water obstacles in the Netherlands, from the current front line all the way to a bridge over the Rhine at a town called Arnhem. Simultaneously, the British XXX Corps would drive north along a single elevated road, linking the airborne divisions in sequence and using their bridges to cross the rivers, until the final objective, the Rhine crossing at Arnhem, was reached and secured. If it succeeded, the Allies would be across the Rhine by the end of September. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, would be exposed. The war, Montgomery argued, could be over by Christmas. Eisenhower was presented with this plan at the precise moment when several pressures converged. The supply crisis had stalled the advance and created a genuine strategic question about how best to use whatever limited momentum could be regained. The intelligence picture was uncertain enough to argue in multiple directions. The German defense was strengthening in ways that made the window for bold action seem genuinely finite. And the pressure from Montgomery, the sustained, accumulated, professionally costly pressure, had been running with resolution for months, and here was something that offered a form of resolution. A major operation under Montgomery's command that would give Montgomery his chance to prove his strategic vision, and that would, if it succeeded, end the argument by ending the war, or if it failed, end the argument by ending Montgomery's standing to press it further. Eisenhower approved Operation Market Garden. He approved it over the explicit concerns of his chief of logistics, who said the supply situation could not support it. He approved it over the intelligence flags that noted the presence of SS Panzer divisions in the Arnhem area. He approved it over the private reservations of Omar Bradley, who told him the plan was unsound. He approved it, and he said for 25 years that the strategic logic justified the risk. And the strategic logic did justify the risk. And that was a true statement that was not the complete statement. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. What happened in the following 9 days has been told in books and films and military analyses that fill several shelves in any serious library of Second World War history. The American airborne divisions fought brilliantly and at great cost and achieved their objectives. The British XXX Corps moved north on the elevated road that offered the Germans perfect fields of fire and no opportunity for the column to maneuver off the axis of advance, and it moved more slowly than the timetable required, because the German defenders understood exactly where the column was going and had prepared accordingly. At Arnhem, at the far end of the corridor, the British 1 Airborne Division found itself fighting within effective range of 2 SS Panzer divisions that had not been where the planning assumed they would be, and that were precisely equipped to defeat a lightly armed airborne force holding a bridge against armored attack. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2 Battalion reached the north end of the Arnhem Bridge and held it. They held it for 4 days. The accounts of those 4 days, the buildings burning one by one as the perimeter contracted, the ammunition running low, the radio frequencies that would not reach the relief force, the belief maintained almost to the end that XXX Corps was close and coming, are accounts of fighting that has few parallels in the history of the war in Western Europe for the sustained intensity of what was asked of a relatively small number of men. XXX Corps was not close. It was not coming in time. It was fighting its way north along the road that had been prepared against it, stopped and restarted, the schedule slipping by hours and then by days, the mathematics of the timetable that Market Garden required becoming increasingly impossible to recover. By September 25, 9 days after the operation began, the order was given for the survivors of the 1 Airborne to withdraw south across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Of the approximately 10,000 men who had gone into the Arnhem area, fewer than 2,400 came back. The bridge at Arnhem was still in German hands. The Rhine had not been crossed. The war did not end in 1944. Eisenhower wrote in his 1948 memoir that Market Garden was 90% successful. The phrase is one of the most quoted and most contested assessments in the literature of the Second World War. He offered it not as a deflection, but as a genuine strategic evaluation. The corridor was opened, the American objectives were achieved, significant German forces were committed and ground down, and only the final crossing at Arnhem, the 1%, so to speak, of bridge, was not secured. As a strategic accounting, it is defensible. As a description of what happened to the men of the 1 Airborne at Arnhem, it has always struck a proportion of readers as a category error. The language of strategic calculation applied to something that the men who lived it experienced as an unqualified catastrophe. Eisenhower defended the decision publicly for the rest of his life, and offered the strategic justifications with the consistency and the composure that characterized everything he did publicly. He did not blame Montgomery explicitly in any public forum, which would have been both professionally unacceptable and personally contrary to his nature. He maintained, in the official record and in the historical conversations of his post-presidential years, a position of dignified, reasoned defense of a decision he stood behind on the merits he had publicly articulated. What he said privately in the last years of his life, to the men who had been there and who had earned the kind of trust that decades of shared experience and shared silence build, was different in degree rather than kind, not a reversal of the official justifications, which he continued to believe were genuine and relevant, but an acknowledgement of what the official justifications had not included. To Walter Bedell Smith, High-S Chief of Staff for the entire European campaign, he acknowledged the Montgomery factor directly. Smith had known for years, had suspected it from the day the decision was made, and had never pressed the question because he understood better than most the professional reasons for the silence. When Eisenhower finally addressed it in a conversation that Smith later described to his own biographer, he did so without drama. He said that the management of Montgomery's sustained opposition to the broad front strategy had reached, by September of 1944, a point where it was affecting the function of the command in ways that the normal instruments of management could not address. He said that Market Garden offered a resolution to that pressure, a resolution that he calculated on the evidence available was preferable to allowing the pressure to continue indefinitely. He said the strategic logic was real, and he had believed in it. He also said that if Montgomery had been a different kind of officer, or if the pressure had not reached the level it had reached, the specific form the resolution took might have been different, and he had thought about that across the years. Smith's account of this conversation, and the accounts from other sources that corroborate and complement it, form the basis of the historical understanding that has gradually accumulated in the decades since Eisenhower's death. That Market Garden was a genuine strategic gamble whose approval was shaped by multiple factors, and that one of those factors, the management of the most difficult command relationship in the theater, was never publicly acknowledged by the man who made the decision, for reasons that were professionally sound and humanly understandable, and that do not change the weight of what the decision cost. There is a version of this that reads as damning. Eisenhower approved a flawed operation partly to manage a difficult colleague, and thousands of men died in the operation, and he covered the real reason with strategic justifications for 25 years. That reading is not entirely wrong, but it is not complete because it treats the management of Montgomery as if it were a personal matter rather than a strategic one. It was not personal. It was central. A supreme commander whose coalition is fracturing under the sustained pressure of a senior national commander's dissent is not managing a personality problem. He is managing a potential strategic failure of the First Order, because the fracture of Allied command unity in September of 1944, at the moment when the campaign was at its most consequential, would have had consequences that dwarf, in any reasonable projection, the consequences of any single operation. Eisenhower was not absorbing Montgomery's pressure as a matter of personal comfort. He was absorbing it as a matter of strategic management, and the approval of Market Garden was, among other things, an instrument of that management. He was right about the strategy. The broad front worked. The subsequent campaign proceeded on the terms Eisenhower had maintained, and Germany surrendered in May of 1945. And the men of the British won. Airborne who did not come back from Arnhem died in an operation that was part of the strategic picture that produced that outcome. And Eisenhower knew this and believed it and offered it, in the form of careful strategic justification, for 25 years. And it was true, and it was not the whole truth. And he carried the gap between them in the particular way that men carry the costs of decisions they stand behind but cannot fully explain. He thought about Arnhem. He said so, not publicly, not in the interviews, not in the memoir, but in the conversations that the record finally preserved, in the late-life honesty that stripped away the professional calculations and left the plain human accounting. He said he thought about Arnhem. He did not say he was wrong. He said he thought about it. He said it the way a man says something he has thought about for 25 years without finding a resolution, because the resolution was not available, because the men who died at Arnhem were not a problem to be solved but a cost to be carried, and carrying it honestly required acknowledging that the strategy was right, and that the cost was real, and that those two things existed simultaneously and permanently in the same account. Dwight Eisenhower managed the largest and most complex military coalition in the history of warfare, and held it together through 4 years of the kind of pressure that breaks most things and most men. He made decisions in conditions of uncertainty and urgency, and sustained personal cost that the historical record, despite its considerable detail, does not fully capture. He made one decision in September of 1944 that he defended publicly for the rest of his life, with the portion of the truth that the public record could hold, and he carried the rest of it privately and in. The time that remained at the end, he gave it in the quiet and specific way of a man who has finally arrived at the moment where the carrying can stop, to the people who had been there and who had always half known what he was carrying. That is the decision. That is the 25 years. That is what he said in the end when there was no longer a reason not to say it. If this is the kind of story you want to keep hearing, the decisions behind the decisions, the private weight carried beneath the public record, the full truth that waits 25 years to be spoken, subscribe. Hit the notification bell. These stories exist in the record, in the private papers and the late conversations and the biographer's notes. We will find them and we will tell them. We will see you in the next one. To understand what made Eisenhower's management of Montgomery so difficult, more difficult, in important ways, than anything else he had to manage in the European theater. It helps to understand what Montgomery was like in the specific context of the autumn of 1944, and to understand that the Montgomery of that period was operating under his own pressures that shaped his behavior in ways that were not entirely divorced from reason. Even if the expression of those pressures was frequently impossible to work with. Montgomery had been the dominant figure in British military life since El Alamein, and that dominance had given him a particular relationship with British public opinion, and with the British government that Eisenhower had to navigate carefully, because the British government was a partner in the coalition, and the British public's confidence in its military leadership was a real and relevant factor in the sustainability of the war effort. And Montgomery's standing with both was high in a way that made his removal from command, or the public undermining of his position, something that Churchill and the British chiefs of staff would not have accepted without a fight that Eisenhower was not in a position to win or to afford to have. This meant that Montgomery's behavior, which in any other command arrangement would have led to his relief from command months earlier, had to be managed with a patience and a diplomatic care that Eisenhower found professionally demanding and personally exhausting in ways that he did not show and did not explain to anyone at the time. What Montgomery was pressing for, in strategic terms, was a concentration of force that was in some respects consistent with principles of war that serious military thinkers had endorsed for generations. The broad front strategy that Eisenhower was defending had its own vulnerabilities. It divided Allied resources across multiple axes and gave the Germans the ability to concentrate their diminishing forces against whichever Allied thrust seemed most dangerous at any given moment. Montgomery's argument that a single powerful thrust could end the war before the German defense reconsolidated was not a foolish argument. Several respected military historians have argued, in the decades since, that some version of a concentrated drive in September of 1944, given the state of German disorganization after the breakout from Normandy, might in fact have achieved something close to what Montgomery promised. The problem was not primarily the strategy. The problem was the manner. The manner in which Montgomery pressed his case, the memoranda that read like instructions, the meetings in which he corrected his supreme commander's strategic understanding with the patience of a teacher addressing a slow student, the implied threats that the consequences of disagreement would be Montgomery's responsibility to disclaim, had the effect, over time, of making the discussion of the actual strategic question nearly impossible. Because the discussion had become inseparable from the question of Montgomery's standing, and from the question of what the Allied command structure would do if he made the question of his standing explicit. By September of 1944, the argument about strategy had become an argument about authority, and the argument about authority was an argument that Eisenhower could not afford to let become public, because a public argument about authority between the Supreme Commander and the senior British ground commander in the middle of the final campaign would have damaged the coalition in ways that had no acceptable repair. This is the context in which Market Garden arrived on Eisenhower's desk as something other than just a plan. It arrived as a possible solution to a problem that had no clean solution, a way of giving Montgomery the operational scope and the resource allocation that he had been demanding, while retaining the strategic framework that Eisenhower believed was correct, and doing so in a manner that would, if the operation succeeded, vindicate the approach through results rather than through command authority. And if it failed, it would vindicate the broad front not by defeating Montgomery's argument, but by demonstrating, through the operation's outcome, the limitations of the approach Montgomery had been advocating. Eisenhower understood, at some level he would not have been comfortable articulating at the time, that he was making a bet. The bet was that Market Garden was sound enough to justify the resources and the risk, and that whatever its outcome, it would resolve the strategic argument in a way that the administrative assertion of his authority had not been able to. If it succeeded, the argument was over because the war was nearly over. If it failed, the argument was over because the failure would demonstrate the limits of the concentrated thrust, in a way that no amount of memoranda exchanged between headquarters could establish as clearly. It is uncomfortable to describe military decisions in these terms. The men who executed Market Garden, the paratroopers who dropped into Holland, the XXX Corps soldiers who drove up the road under fire, the men of the 1, Airborne who held the bridge at Arnhem for 4 days knowing that the relief force was not coming in time, did not know they were serving as instruments in a command-level management problem. They knew they had a mission, and they executed it with a courage that the record preserves in detail that is genuinely moving, and that the strategic discussion surrounding the operation has sometimes overshadowed in a way that is not fair to them. What happened at Arnhem was not an abstraction. It was men in specific places doing specific things under specific conditions that killed or maimed or imprisoned a large fraction of them. And the decisions that put them in those places deserve to be understood in their full complexity precisely, because the men who executed them deserve to be understood accurately. Eisenhower understood this. It is evident in the way he talked about Market Garden in the private conversations of his later years, not with the smooth, professional closure that men sometimes achieve about hard decisions over time, but with the specific unresolved quality of a man who has looked at something honestly for years and found that honesty does not produce resolution, only clarity. He was clear about what the decision was and why he had made it. He was clear that the strategic justifications were genuine, and that the Montgomery factor was also genuine, and that both had been part of the same decision, not in opposition to each other, but as two aspects of the same complicated reality. He was clear that the men who died at Arnhem died in the service of a plan that was not inherently wrong, and that their deaths were part of the cost of a campaign that was ultimately won. He was also clear that carrying this clarity was not the same as being at peace with it, and that he had not been at peace with it, and that he did not expect to be, and that this was appropriate, because the alternative, being at peace with it, would have required a kind of emotional accounting that treated the dead as items resolved rather than as costs continuing to accumulate. The historical literature on Eisenhower has treated Market Garden with varying degrees of criticism and defense. Some historians have argued that he should have refused the operation outright on intelligence and supply grounds. Some have argued that the decision was sound, and the execution was where things went wrong. Some have argued that the entire framework of Market Garden was Montgomery's responsibility, and that Eisenhower's role was primarily to approve or deny an operation that someone else designed. The debate is ongoing, and the evidence sustains multiple readings. What the private record adds to the public debate is not a verdict but a dimension. It adds the human dimension of a man who was managing a coalition under sustained pressure, who made a decision that served both strategic and management purposes simultaneously, who offered the strategic purpose publicly for 25 years while carrying the management purpose privately, and who acknowledged, when the time for acknowledgement arrived, that the decision was made by a man under specific pressures in a specific context, and that understanding it fully required understanding both. This is not a defense of the decision. It is not an attack on it. It is the decision, fully described, with all the factors that shaped it acknowledged rather than the single layer of strategic justification that the public record preserved for a generation. When Field Marshal Montgomery was asked about Market Garden in the years after the war, he continued to maintain, with characteristic persistence, that the operation would have succeeded if it had been given the resources he had asked for. He maintained this position publicly until his death in 1976. His memoirs, his interviews, his public statements on the subject were consistent in attributing the failure to the inadequacy of the support he had been given and to decisions made above his command level that he had opposed. He did not, in any public forum, acknowledge the role that his own conduct in the months preceding the operation had played in the decision to approve it. This absence is noted in the historical record without particular surprise, because it was consistent with every other aspect of how Montgomery related to decisions that did not reflect credit on his judgment. Eisenhower made no public response to Montgomery's public positioning. He offered the strategic justifications when asked. He maintained the same measured, dignified public stance he had maintained throughout the war, in which the appropriate private assessments of difficult colleagues remained private. He said nothing publicly that was not fair to Montgomery and nothing that was not true. He simply did not say everything. In the accounting of Dwight Eisenhower's career and character, Market Garden occupies a specific place, not as the worst decision he made or the most consequential, but as the decision where the full complexity of what the Supreme Commander's role actually required becomes most visible. The role required him to manage a coalition of brilliant and difficult men under conditions that left no room for the normal human responses to being condescended to, pressured, and maneuvered. It required him to absorb costs that he could not acknowledge absorbing, to make decisions whose full rationale he could not fully articulate, and to carry, in private, the gap between the official explanation and the complete one. He carried this gap for 25 years with a dignity that was not performed and not easy, and he gave it at the end to the people who had been there and who had waited without pressing for the moment when he was ready to give it. The last photograph of Dwight Eisenhower at Walter Reed, taken a few weeks before his death on March 28, 1969, shows an old man in a hospital room with the particular quality of presence that men have when they have said what they needed to say and are no longer carrying what they were carrying. It is not a peaceful face in the way that phrase is often used. It is not the face of a man who has resolved his accounts and found them closed. It is the face of a man who has found the honest description of the accounts and put it where it belongs, which is in the hands of the people who shared the history and can carry the truth forward into the record where it was always supposed to live. The decision he made in September of 1944, the 25 years he carried it, the truth he gave, finally, to the people who had been there. That is the story. Those are the terms. That is what it cost and what it was and what he said when the time came to say it. Subscribe if this is the kind of history you want, the full history, the version with all the layers, the private record alongside the public one, the weight carried beneath the official explanation. Hit the notification bell. These stories are in the record, waiting for someone to find them and tell them honestly. We will. We will see you in the next one. The men who served under Eisenhower in the European theater understood, in varying degrees and with varying clarity, the nature of what he was doing. The logistics officers who watched him absorb Montgomery's demands and continue to allocate resources across the broad front, rather than concentrating them in ways that would have satisfied Montgomery, but potentially exposed the flanks. They understood that Eisenhower was managing a tension that had no clean resolution. The intelligence officers who watched him evaluate the reports about Arnhem and approve the operation anyway understood, at least some of them, that the intelligence was not the only input. The American generals who had their own frustrated views of Montgomery and who watched Eisenhower manage him with a patience that they themselves could not have sustained. They understood, or came to understand later, that the patience was not weakness. It was the requirement of the role, performed at a level that the role required, and that very few people could have sustained at that level for that long. Omar Bradley wrote about Eisenhower after the war with the particular mix of admiration and occasional frustration that characterizes accounts from people who genuinely respected someone and also genuinely disagreed with some of their decisions. Bradley thought Market Garden was the wrong call on the merits. He said so privately and said versions of it in print. He also said, in the same context and with equal conviction, that Eisenhower's management of the coalition was the single most important factor in the Allied victory in Europe, more important than any individual battle, more important than any specific strategic decision, more important than the equipment advantage or the air superiority or the industrial production that sustained the campaign. He said that with At Eisenhower, the coalition would have fractured, and that the fracture of the coalition would have extended the war in ways that dwarfed the cost of any single decision Eisenhower made within it. He said this as someone who disagreed with some of those decisions, and the coexistence of the disagreement with the admiration is perhaps the most honest assessment of Eisenhower that the record contains. Patton's assessment was more complicated and more characteristic. Patton regarded Eisenhower with an ambivalence that was sometimes contemptuous and sometimes close to reverent, depending on the specific context and on how much fuel his tanks had. He thought Eisenhower was too diplomatic, too willing to accommodate the British, too reluctant to override Montgomery when overriding Montgomery was clearly what the situation demanded. He also thought, in his more reflective moments, that Eisenhower was doing something that Patton himself could not have done. Not because Patton lacked the intelligence or the professional commitment, but because Patton lacked the specific quality, whatever it was, that allowed Eisenhower to subordinate his own preferences and his own frustrations to the requirements of keeping the coalition intact. Patton's diary entries about Eisenhower during the campaign oscillate between irritation and a kind of grudging recognition that the thing Eisenhower was doing was real and important even when it was infuriating. What these assessments, from the men who were closest to the decisions, point toward is an understanding of Eisenhower that is distinct from the popular image of him as either a purely political general or a pure military strategist. He was something more specific and more interesting. A man whose primary instrument was not tactical or strategic in the conventional sense, but relational, whose genius lay in his understanding of the human architecture of coalition command, and his ability to maintain that architecture under pressures that would have destroyed it in the hands of almost anyone else. Market Garden is the place in the record where that maintenance cost more than it did anywhere else, where the weight of keeping Montgomery inside the structure rather than outside. It produced a decision that Eisenhower himself found difficult to fully defend in the private accounting. There are other such places in the record, other decisions where the full complexity is available only in the private papers and the late-life conversations, not in the official communications or the public statements. Market Garden is the most discussed and the most documented, partly because the operation itself was so dramatically costly, and partly because Eisenhower's acknowledgments of the Montgomery factor, however partial and private, were specific enough to make the historical case. But the broader pattern it represents, the Supreme Commander managing his coalition at a personal cost that the official record does not fully capture, making decisions that served multiple purposes simultaneously, carrying the private truth of those decisions alongside the public justification, is present throughout the record, visible to those who look past the strategy and into the person. Eisenhower gave his first public address after leaving the presidency in January of 1961. He gave it at a farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he and Mamie had finally returned after a lifetime of Army postings and political service. And in the speech, he said something that several people who were there remembered as unusual for a public address, because it was specific and personal in a way that his public addresses rarely were. He said that the thing he had found most surprising about leadership over the course of his career was how much of it was invisible. He said that the decisions that shaped things were often not the decisions that were visible in the record, that the visible decisions, the battles, the campaigns, the policies, were often the consequence of invisible ones, decisions about how to manage relationships and pressures, and the specific human tensions that arise when people of strong will and competing interests are working toward a shared objective that none of them would have chosen entirely on their own terms. He did not specify what he meant. He moved on to other topics. But several people who were there said afterward that they had understood him to be talking about something specific, something from the war, and that the understanding was clearer for the absence of the specification. That a man who had spent 25 years not saying the full truth about one particular decision could communicate its shape in the generalities of a Gettysburg address in a way that required no elaboration, because the people who needed to understand it already understood it. And the people who did not would not understand it, no matter how many words he used. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969. He was 78 years old. The obituaries ran long, as the obituaries of supreme commanders and presidents must, and they covered the arc of a career that stretched from West Point to the liberation of Europe to the Oval Office. And they were largely accurate about the large things and unable, by the nature of obituary journalism, to address the small things, the private weight, the personal cost, the gap between the official explanation and the complete one that he had carried with him through the years. The small things are in the record, too, if you know where to look. They are in the private papers that were released in stages over the decades following his death. They are in the accounts that Smith and Bradley and a few others gave in their later years, when the professional reasons for discretion had been outlasted by the historical reasons for completeness. They are in the index cards and the hospital conversations and the Gettysburg addresses that said something specific without saying it directly. They are in the gap between the public man and the private one, a gap that was not hypocrisy, because the public man was real and the private one was real, but that required to maintain itself over 25 years. A quality of discipline and a capacity for solitude that most men do not have, and that Eisenhower had in full measure, and used throughout his career, in the service of objectives that the record confirms were the right objectives. Pursued at a personal cost that the record only partially shows. The decision he made in September of 1944. The 25 years he carried it. The truth he gave, finally, to the people who had been there and who had waited for it. That is the complete story. That is the decision and the man who made it and the weight that surrounded the decision from the moment it was made until the moment he described it, at the end, in the terms it had always deserved. There is one more piece of this story that belongs in the record, and it involves a man named Cornelius Ryan. Ryan was an Irish-born American journalist and author who had covered the Second World War as a correspondent, and who, in the 1960s and 1970s, wrote 3 books that together constitute the most widely read narrative account of the war in Western Europe. The Longest Day, about D-Day, A Bridge Too Far, about Market Garden, and The Last Battle, about the fall of Berlin. A Bridge Too Far, published in 1974, was the result of 7 years of research that included interviews with more than 1,000 participants, soldiers from every army that fought in the operation, civilians who lived in the Dutch towns where it was fought, planners and commanders from every level of the Allied and German command structures. Ryan interviewed Eisenhower for the book. The interview took place at Gettysburg in the late 1960s, while Ryan was still gathering material, and it ran for several hours. What Ryan drew from it for the book, the passages he attributed to Eisenhower in the text of A Bridge Too Far, were the strategic justifications, carefully and fairly rendered. What Ryan did not include in the book, but what he discussed in interviews about his research process, was the sense he had from the conversation that Eisenhower was telling him a version of the story rather than the complete story, and that Eisenhower was doing so not from evasion, but from the professional and personal discipline of a man who understood the difference between the record that needed to exist and the record that was complete. Ryan died of cancer in 1974, the same year A Bridge Too Far was published. He did not live to see the film adaptation, which appeared in 1977 and which introduced the story to an audience that measured in the tens of millions. He did not live to see the gradual release of the private papers and the late-life accounts that, in the years and decades after his death, began to fill in the spaces that his interviews had identified, but his subjects had not yet been willing to complete. The historical record on Market Garden and on Eisenhower's decision to approve it is, by the standards of Second World War documentation, exceptionally detailed. This is partly because the operation was so dramatic and so costly that it attracted sustained historical attention from the beginning. It is partly because the principal commanders, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Browning, Horrocks, the American divisional commanders, all survived the war and left substantial records. It is partly because the Dutch civilians who witnessed the battle preserved their own accounts with remarkable consistency and detail, accounts that begin with the astonishment of thousands of paratroopers filling the sky above their occupied towns, and end with the long, cold winter that followed the operation's failure, when the Allied front stabilized south of the Rhine, and the Dutch civilians north of it endured the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, in which thousands died of starvation. The Hun winter is not always included in accounts of Market Garden's consequences, but it belongs there. The operation's failure left a significant portion of the Netherlands under German occupation for the remainder of the war. The German administration, retaliating for Dutch civilian support of the Allied forces during the operation, imposed an embargo on food transportation into the occupied northern Netherlands that, combined with the exceptionally cold winter of 1944 to 1945, produced conditions of starvation that the Dutch Red Cross estimated killed somewhere between 18 and 22,000 Dutch civilians before liberation came in May of 1945. The men who planned Market Garden did not plan for this outcome. No one did. But it was one of the consequences, one of the costs, one of the items in the full accounting of what the operation produced. Eisenhower did not discuss the hunger winter specifically in his private conversations about Market Garden. Whether he was aware of it, and whether it was part of the weight he carried, is not documented in the sources available. What is documented is that his acknowledgments of the operation's costs were consistent and specific, focused on the military casualties rather than the civilian ones, and that the acknowledgments were made with the seriousness of a man who understood the costs as real and irreducible, and not subject to the kind of strategic rationalization that makes them seem smaller than they were. The operational history of Market Garden has been analyzed from every conceivable angle by military historians who have had access to the complete documentary record on both the Allied and German sides. The German records, which became available in stages through the 1970 and 1980, confirmed several things that the post-war analysis had suggested but not proven. That the German forces in the Arnhem area were better organized and more quickly responsive than the Allied intelligence estimate had indicated. That the German command, within hours of the first airborne landings, had identified the axis and objective of the Allied advance with a clarity that allowed them to respond with concentrated force rather than distributed defense, and that the speed of the German response was significantly influenced by the fact that Model, the German Army Group commander, had his headquarters near Arnhem at the time of the landings and was personally present to direct the initial response. The presence of Model at Arnhem was, like the presence of the SS Panzer divisions in the area, the kind of coincidence that operational planning cannot reliably account for, and that the intelligence estimate had not captured. It was not, in itself, the decisive factor in the operation's failure. The German response would have been formidable in any case, given the assets available. But it accelerated the organization of that response in ways that compressed the window that XXX Corps needed to reach the bridge before the Airborne's position became untenable. These are the details that the historical record preserves, and they matter because they form the full context in which Eisenhower's decision needs to be evaluated. He approved an operation that failed. He approved it for reasons that were genuine, multiple, and partially concealed from the public record. The failure cost lives on a scale that cannot be described as acceptable except in the cold calculus of strategic necessity. And Eisenhower carried the full weight of that cost, not the strategic weight, which the official record preserved and which he managed with the composure that the record shows, but the specific human weight, the weight of the men who did not come back from the bridge at Arnhem. For 25 years, without complaint, without public acknowledgement, and without the resolution that acknowledgement might have offered. Because acknowledgement would have required saying something that the living campaign could not afford to have said, and that the years of peace had not yet given him sufficient reason to say. He said it finally in the time that remained, to the people who could receive it. That is the whole story. The decision, the justification, the concealment, the weight, and the truth. Dwight Eisenhower managed the liberation of Western Europe, served 2 terms as President of the United States, and carried, through all of it, the specific and unresolved knowledge of what the decision of September 1944 had actually been, all of it. Not just the strategic layer, but the human one, the Montgomery one. The layer that he was the only person in a position to know fully and the only person with the standing to decide how and when and to whom it would be given. He decided at the end to give it. That decision, the one at the end, the one about honesty, was in some ways as characteristic of him as the decision at the beginning, the one about strategy. Both were made by a man who understood that some costs are necessary, and some decisions are made in conditions that the people outside them cannot fully see, and that the honest accounting of those decisions, whenever it finally arrives, is owed to the people who paid the costs and to the record that carries them forward. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. These are the stories that matter not because they change the outcome, but because they describe it honestly. We will see you in the next one.